Hi everyone, welcome to the studio. It's been a while since I made a video, but I decided I would make this one initially for my class because it involves a tutorial and demonstration of how to, or how I paint ceramics using watercolours. I got the inspiration from a short on Instagram. There was a lady painting quite beautiful Chinese or certainly Asian ceramics that looked quite historic, and she was making a fantastic job of it. She didn't do any preparatory drawing, she just went straight in with a wash and then worked wet into that wash and produced quite a fantastic result. There are several of those videos out there, and I was very impressed with this, and I thought she's obviously practiced a lot to achieve that level of skill, and I thought I would have a go at it, and it might be quite a good class or workshop. So I had a go, found it quite difficult but practiced quite hard, and the video itself is going to be painting this watercolour. So the following video will begin with me showing you just a few of those initial works, and then I'll talk a little bit about the process and the drawing of it, which is quite simple. There's not a lot of drawing involved in terms of preparatory drawing, and then I go straight into the video. I've made some time lapses of some of them, but this is actually filmed in real time and just edited so that all the unnecessary bits aren't there. So I hope you enjoy it. Please like and subscribe if you do, and I'll answer any comments if you have any questions, if you care to make any. So enjoy. So this is the first one, and it is quite a complicated image. I started off by laying in the structure in a wash, and then whilst it was drying, at different stages of the drying, I began to work into it. There's quite a lot of bleed takes place, but then you can go back in and work over that bleed with drier paint. The next one I wanted to do was something without a pattern on it, which was more a kind of iridescent vase, which was quite tricky actually. Then I moved on to this jug, had a bash at that one. Again, there's quite a lot of structure. I looked for things with highlights in and with a definite shape. Next I moved on to a teapot. It was an English teapot, and it had a bit of an irregular pattern on the lid actually, which was quite tricky. You can see the size of it. I hold my hand up. Again, looking for things with highlights. This I think was a Staffordshire jug, possibly Staffordshire. Anyway, faceted in this one. The lighting on it wasn't brilliant. I decided also to have a go at silver teapot, and I painted this in just cobalt blue first in different layers, which is a method I often use, and then worked over it with the wet in wet in a similar way to the others. And I had a go at a couple of others, as you can see here. The first one on unstretched paper, because I knew a lot of my class wouldn't use stretched paper. I just wanted to see if it was possible before I subjected them to this, because there's quite a lot of wet technique and it does tend to buckle the paper. The second one was on a block actually, rather than stretched paper, and so the result was that it remains flatter. You can see the differences though. When you're working at high speed, wet in wet, you do get differences. So here's the piece I'm going to be working on in the video, and I didn't record the drawing process, but I just want to talk a bit about it. First of all, I do a very light centre line and draw that in quite lightly, and then mark the top and the bottom using the reference. I decided to come up with this method to make it easier for my class, and I look for the symmetry of the piece, the main symmetry of the body, and then I'll just make some marks using the reference that I've got. This drawing's actually nothing to do with the main video, so I'll draw in half of the pot. Now if it's got a spout or a handle, I'll leave that off this stage, and I'll carefully just draw it in a very simple linear way, so you've just got a very smooth as possible line that's as accurate as possible. At this stage you can go in very lightly and make as many corrections as possible. Then take a piece of tracing paper I just decided to put one or two other marks in which I didn't actually trace, but they signify some of the pattern on that particular pot. So the next stage is to take some tracing paper and using a soft pencil. I think I used a 3B there. I advise taping it down ideally, but I didn't in this case. Make a reference mark where the top and bottom of the pot hit the center line, and then you can just trace the half that you have drawn. So I'm tracing it with a soft pencil, just neatly following the line that I've already drawn as accurately as I can. Symmetry is very important. The actual strength of the shape of the design is really important. So you want that line to be nice and clean, and you want to achieve a nice symmetrical design. Then you simply turn it over, realign those registration points that you have made already, and then using a slightly harder pencil, or you can carry on using the same pencil, but I use a slightly harder one, and preferably tape it down again. You simply trace it. I position the paper just so that it's easier for my hand to make a sweeping curve. So I put the page in a position that I find easiest for my hand to make those marks as smoothly and cleanly as possible. So I just move it yet again and continue drawing that line until I've achieved the full shape. As I say, any other parts that I need to add, I can add later. And I don't draw any of the patterning or anything else. It's just simply to get the outline. The demonstration I saw on Instagram, they didn't seem to be any lines on the page at all. Maybe I couldn't see them, or maybe they were just fantastic at it. I'm suspecting they'd done a lot of them, and so they really had their eye into this kind of thing. So I just clean up the drawing a little bit so there are no fluffy lines, and so that it's all nice and clean and tidy and as faint as possible, just enough to see. You can hardly see it on the video, so apologies for that. So here is the photograph I was working from, and I've drawn it out already. As I say, it was a different drawing from the one that I've just shown you. So I've got two palettes, and one's my main palette, a larger one at the bottom, and the top one is just merely there really to provide more mixing space. And I start by mixing up some cobalt blue, and I think that was Naples yellow. So I mix the two pools, and then I'll mix a little bit of both of them, well, quite a lot of both of them together. Now, because this vase vessel only has, well, because this vessel has two parts, i.e. a lid and the bottom, there's a dividing line, and so I can work on just the top down to where the lid joins the main vessel. And I'm going in pretty wet, so you mix up enough paint so that you've got enough and you don't have to keep stopping and mixing. And I'm leaving the highlights white. So the initial wash, I'm using a large enough brush to hold plenty of paint. Then I'm using a bit of a smaller brush because I just want to, there are some other slight highlight areas just underneath those larger highlights. And then the rim is a lot darker. So I'm taking my time, keeping it all wet. Ideally I'd be working on an incline, but I find it easier to make a film with it not on an incline. And the same goes for when you're doing live demos, because I don't tend to work on an easel when I'm doing watercolour. So basically it's still wet and the rim is quite dark. So I'm laying in an initial wash, and this will mix on the page, but it will also bleed quite a lot, as you can see. But that's okay, because you can tighten that up as things begin to dry. One of the reasons I wanted to do this was because working wet in wet is something that you need to know quite a bit about, really, and it takes quite a lot of work to get experience at it, and you can end up trashing a lot of paper, and a lot of people are reluctant to do that. I find in my classes that some people have watercolour paper, but they don't even use it in the class, and I keep telling them, use the paper, you need to use the paper, but they tend to sort of use cartridge paper. I guess as an aversion to using relatively expensive materials, and people worry that they're going to waste it, but in some ways you have to waste it. You have to invest in yourself and in your practice. So as you can see, quite a pleasing effect of bleeding is taking place, and to a certain extent with a bit of tissue paper you can dab things away and adjust them. A lot of this will dry lighter than it is appearing at the moment. When it's wet, it maintains some of the fresh, darker, glistening qualities, but as it dries it lightens a little bit. And also a certain amount of the moisture causes dilution to keep going, and dispersion, and so the paints will thin out even more. So I'm thinking carefully now, what am I going to do next, and mixing up a whole load more of that particular mix of paint. I want it to be harmonious with the actual lid as well, and appear that it all is made of the same material. So now I'm committed to the larger area. I'm not going to paint the handles yet, but I'm committed to this larger bulbous body of the pot. And as I work, I'm just being mindful of where the highlights are, because in that first wash, first pass, you want to leave those highlights white. They may not be exactly the right shape, but in many ways you can correct that later, but you need to leave the white of the page, because that's the strong, bright area. And if you've got a slight slope, you've got your bead of wetness always at the bottom. It is appearing as if it's at the bottom there, but that's because I've pushed it down. So you're really floating a lot of paint on the page and hardly brushing it over much. You're keeping the brushwork light and just pushing the paint around, pushing the pool of pigment around. There's another highlight there, quite a large one. It's a lot softer, and it goes across one of the figures that appears in the design on the pot. So you've got to be careful it doesn't dry at this stage, because if it starts to dry you're going to get hard lines and you're going to get uneven water dryings. I.e., what I mean is the water will dry unevenly and therefore you might get tide marks. So you want to keep a certain amount of moisture alive rather than let it dry out at this stage. So you have to work very quickly, and when you're trying to film and be aware of highlights and worry that your battery might run out or your camera might just turn off, because I use quite old cameras and they have a habit of doing that, then you've got to keep your wits about you, which puts quite a lot of pressure on you. And it is a bit akin to doing a live demonstration in front of people, where you have to think of everything and keep talking and narrating, as I'm doing at the moment. So whilst it's all wet, you can add some darker tones or values of using the mixes of the paints you've already used. So you can see quite a hard lines developed at the top there across the higher part of the main body. But I'll come back and sort that out. It's still wet. And now I'm putting in some of the darks to help try and establish the form. The photo itself that I was using has some highlights. There's a lot of pattern, but the actual form isn't described terribly well. So I'm exaggerating things a little bit and making some of the darks a little darker than they actually are. And because I've painted some of the pots already, I've got a good idea of what works. Also, because I'm not painting any background in here, it's just an exercise in wet in wet. I'm trying to get people used to working wet in wet. And even though they may not produce anything such as a finished painting or illustration even, it's basically learning some of these methods and becoming initially familiar with them. You're getting an idea, you're getting a taster. And a lot of people just shy clear of this because it's quite a tricky thing to do, and we feel safer often just doing wet on dry and very carefully building things up with layers and glazes. There is an element of that in this kind of work, but the initial lay-in is this lovely wet in wet, and if it works, if you can carry it off, it's well worth doing. Now I'm working on unstretched paper on a spiral pad here, again just to prove that it works. This is slightly thicker than the other one that I did, that I showed in the introduction, which has some warp to it. And it doesn't warp quite so much. So you can also lift out areas by drying your brush off a little bit, but washing it first, drying it off with so you wash it with clean water and then you squeeze most of the water out of it, so it's like a thirsty brush, and you can then lift off some pigment without leaving excess water on the page and causing back runs or cauliflowers, as some people call them. Now I often use warm and cool paints and colours to help identify what things should look like. What do I mean by that? I look for warm and cool areas. So when you've got a mother colour, say the background of this pot is white, I would look for where warm light hits it and where cool light hits it. And if you observe those, they're often quite subtly different from each other, and to some people it may not be that noticeable. But if you start to introduce that into your work and into the way that you paint, it can really help you to make things look more realistic. So there is a pattern running round underneath the lip of the lid, and I start to paint this in a burnt sienna with possibly a little bit of burnt umber mixed in, and I paint it quite freely and impressionistically. It is going to bleed quite a bit, but I'm not too worried about that because it'll bleed and it'll fade, and then I can go over it again. But that's part of the charm of this effect, I think. It's one of the things I was really looking to exploit and play with. I don't think I've mastered it by any means. I think it takes some time to really master, and you have to be prepared to put a lot of practice in to get to that stage. And I find that I'd like to explore it further. So doing exercises like this really helps, because in teaching people I develop all kinds of language about the individual processes, and it makes me more aware of what I'm actually doing rather than just intuitively doing it and then maybe forgetting. So again, using a bit of dry tissue, preferably a clean piece, you can dry out certain areas and clean back certain areas before they get too wet. So adding a little bit of dark, which is mixing in on the page. I would think again that's a bit of burnt umber with possibly a little bit of ultramarine blue in there. just to add some contrast and some darkness. So it's just keeping it alive as I go and reiterating that shape. The highlights are a little bit clumsy at the moment, and I'll probably refine those a bit later. The edges too are a little bit clumsy, and maybe I should have waited a little longer for it to dry. But I'm aware the rest of it is drying all the time, all the while that I'm painting this part in. So I've got quite a fine Chinese calligraphy brush here. It has a really fine point, and I use this brush to draw some of the finer details later on, because you can get an almost pen-like line with it. So I just speed up this little bit just to save a little bit of time on the video, and I'm just cleaning up a couple of those edges, and then the line that runs underneath and round the pot, dividing that piece of design, goes round in one sweep. I may just reiterate bits of it, but once you've laid it in, you can easily go round with a slightly darker colour, and it'll follow the water line you've already put down. So I just wet my brush again with some clean water and take most of the moisture off, and I'm wiping out the hard edge of the bottom of that highlight just to soften it into the area that's still drying, the reddy brown area of the design. Same with the left hand one. Just taking my time to get the brush to the right state, mopping up where there's a little bit of bleed underneath that line, and just adding a bit of tone into that area on the right, using a kind of bluish grey. A little bit of the design continues down on that left edge. There's quite a bit darker in there. So there's quite a lot of work, even though it's fairly freely impressionistically painted. There's quite a lot of reworking of various areas, which is all about understanding the drying of the paint. There seems to be a magic window, as well as a fairly considered consistency of paint. It's almost like a hierarchy. You have to add more pigment and less water the more you apply over areas you've already worked on that are drying. The aim is to avoid backruns in this situation. So in order to avoid that, you don't want to put paint that's more watery than what you've already got down on top of what you've already got down, because if you do, that will dilute the area and you will get backruns. So the way to combat that and avoid it is to use a thicker mix. So you have to think carefully about how you're going to build up those layers. That takes experience, and it becomes intuitive eventually. And I'm relatively new to this approach. I've done it in kind of small ways here and there for quite some time, but rarely on this scale, working in larger areas and trying to keep things all going at the same time. You don't necessarily have to paint the whole thing like this, and indeed I think on this example I've tended to allow a lot of the body of the pot to dry more, and then the design, which I've started putting in now, tends to be a little bit more wet on dry. You can re-wet an area with clean water without disturbing it once it's completely dry. If it's still a bit dry, you will disturb it. So here I'm beginning to put in some sort of willow tree effect. There's kind of a feathery willow tree effect in a couple of places, suspended from this top ridge in quite dark paint or glaze, and I split the end of my brush to help create that effect, because that's what it looks like in real life, or at least from the photograph I was working from. So I keep my brush fairly vertical, and I've prepared some paint so that it's not too wet. If the paint's too wet, you don't really get that effect. It's almost like a dry brush effect that you want for something like that. And you're working with fairly dry paint. So even if your surface is fairly wet, it's going to take, not if it's completely wet, but if it's drying, which this is. So you can see the kind of effect. So I've zoomed in a bit, and now you can see what I'm talking about. Just making a few more marks with the finer brush. And you've got to be aware that the pattern follows the form of the pot, so it curves around that form. If you try and paint it too flat, the whole pot's going to look fairly flat. So always bear that in mind when you're painting it in. So I just take my time to have a look at the design and try and break it down into manageable areas. Obviously the people who painted these pots probably did lots and lots of practice, lots and lots of the same things. And maybe they churned out several in a week. Or maybe they painted a little bit at a time, or maybe there was a production line. Whatever, they were very able at what they did. They really knew what they were doing. They understood the design. They'd taken their time to work it all out. And so that's what I tried to do, is at least work it out in a fairly simple, impressionistic way. So the area down here, I believe, represents the land, and it softly fades away from a grey to a lighter grey. There are quite a lot of carefully drawn dots in that area, but I didn't include them in the end. I wanted to keep it as simple as I possibly could, even because it's not a simple design, but I wanted to keep it from being overly fussy and overly about the design itself. Even though it kind of is about the design, it's also about the form of the pot and the technique. So think carefully about what brushes you use on a job like this. Use a big brush for big areas, and obviously medium brushes for medium areas and small brushes for small areas. A lot of people carry on using the same brush for everything, but it really does make a massive difference if you do use different size brushes, especially when you're laying down big washes. Also, do take a break from time to time and stand back and try and see the thing as a whole, because if you look closely at detail all the time, you can get too involved with it and stop seeing the whole thing and how it works. So sped it up a little bit here. I'm just working on the effects of trees, which are kind of background softly painted in. Watercolour lends itself to this quite nicely, and it's a similar process to the other parts of the painting that you've already seen, so I thought I'd speed this one up a little bit. Just working wet into wet. Once I've put a little bit down, you can either soften it or darken it, but there's not a lot to that. That's more or less normal watercolouring. And next I've got to be aware there's a little figure just to more or less the right of where my brush tip is now and down, but there's also other elements in the background that need to be considered. The figure's something I put in a little bit later, So when you actually break a design like this down, initially it looks incredibly complicated, but when you break it down, it isn't as complicated as you think, and it's the best way to approach it, really. And the only thing perhaps that's a bit regrettable is the fact that if you do work like this, sometimes the scale of it can be a little bit out. You've got to be, because you're painting it directly, you're not drawing it out first. You can go wrong with the proportions slightly, and I knew that would be a consequence of working like this, but I thought, well, I'll just keep it going. Painting on curved surfaces can't be easy, and I'm sure that the people who painted these pots when they initially did it found some of those problems themselves, which probably lends quite a bit of charm to some of their work. So just taking my time with the next part, because I've got to work around where the figure will ultimately be. So I'm leaving a little bit of space, and there's a fairly dark area that will fade away again to not very much, and then it joins into a kind of table which I'll work on fairly soon, which is more red, and quite interesting looking at the brushwork on the actual vessel. So I'm beginning to paint in the table now, which is a more reddy brown, and I want the brush marks to be quite direct, and sometimes it takes a deft touch. These can also go wrong, so it's a good idea to practice them as much as you can. And I think a lot of the Asian artists that I like to watch and whose work I've seen, you can tell, in fact there are videos of them practicing different strokes and how to, say, paint a piece of bamboo or a cricket or something like that, and they really practice and practice and do hundreds of them. They become very adept at certain brush marks. So I'm painting in the table legs. They're very short. It's obviously a very low table or bench, and there's a figure, a central figure, a woman sitting on this table, and I'm just allowing, when I paint, leave a space and paint to the left of it, I'm allowing for her figure. She's quite stylized, which is part of the charm of the pot, really. So the figure has a kind of kimono or dress, and it's blue, so I'm mixing the right blue and lightly painting that in, because I don't want the edges to be too hard. I just want them to kind of slightly blend into the table and look all of a piece, really. And I just want to get that area sorted out, so I'm drawing into it a little bit as I go. And then the collar seems to be in kind of 2 or 3 layers coming up around her neck from the shoulder. It's a bit of a silhouette almost, this rendering of the woman. So rather than get into the detail of her head, I'm just going to the left of her body, and there's a suggestion of some foliage there, so I've mixed up a pale green. It actually looks darker than it is there, but that's because the paint's kind of pooled into little pools of thicker paint, but it will dry a lot lighter than that. And it starts to overlap this big highlight, so where it overlaps the highlight I need to make sure it's light, and so I'll dilute that little edge down where it, on the left, that little area touches into the highlight. Now take my time to go back and soften some of these edges before it completely dries. It's a good time to do it because once it's dry, certain pigments will be harder to wash away. They stain the paper a bit more. Now I'm continuing the design of the kind of landscape, the ground if you like. It's just a simple grey wash. And here I'm putting in red of the next person's dress. Now this person, I believe it's a woman, it's difficult to tell but it looks like it, is partly obscured by the highlight. So she's not really that visible, but there are suggestions and you can see the top of her head emerging in a few minutes. But I'm just trying to work crossways. I've worked from right to left largely, and I'll go back in and work on the figures a little bit more in more of a slightly dry brush technique. Back to the calligraphy brush with the very fine point. I've mixed up some paint and I'm very careful to make sure the paint's dried enough so it's not too watery. So I've got just the right consistency. I practice that on a swatch first, just a piece of scrap paper, so that it acts a little bit like a pen now and I can more or less draw with it quite carefully. So I'm really looking at the reference quite carefully here because I want to try and get the character of the Japanese or Chinese person. I'm guessing probably Japanese actually, judging by the hairstyles and the dress. And again, I want it to be quite free and fluid and painted probably as closely to the manner as what it's been painted, but obviously without nearly as much experience. Some of those lines are just very quick, and I'm sure that's how they were drawn on the originals. The body of the kimono is still a little bit wet, so those lines will be and may need to be just revisited later on. There's a suggestion of a tree just beginning behind the lady's, or above and behind the lady's head, and it's in a really dark grey, and so I've mixed up plenty of that, and I'm just painting it quite freely. I'm not overly copying exactly what's there, just getting the essence of it, trying to get the feel of how the branches flow, how the design goes. I think things like that, ideally you should practice quite a lot, and to be honest I didn't, but I ought to have. So I'm just keeping working on that, and where it goes into the highlight again, that will need to be taken down a little bit, which is what you see me doing here, just applying a much weaker mix of the same paint, more diluted. So now I've prepared my calligraphy brush again to the very fine lines of the right hand figure, which I believe is a man, and he's kind of looking at the lady who's sitting on the bench. His clothing is quite similar to theirs, but I think this is a man. It looks as if he's got a beard, which I've just painted in, and his head is particularly, he's looking to his right to look at her, so his body is facing forward. And I want to get the features quite simply done, but hopefully maintain the character without getting too fussy, and keeping some of those lines very sharp and swiftly applied. You can easily go wrong here, maybe I did. Just softening the top of that highlight because it was a little bit too hard. I said I would do that later on, and that was it. And just a few wet loose areas of the left hand figure. Haven't done the head on that one yet, but there's a little bit more of the background landscape to do, and I've made real impression of it. It's not very detailed, and because it's curving away from you and is on more of the side area of the vase, of the vessel rather, I'm not doing a lot to it. There's quite a lovely blue there, and I shall paint that in. It's cerulean I'm using, which is fairly close to what was on the original. And all that's quite soft focus. So now I'm beginning the hair of the left hand figure. So I'm putting on the hair area fairly wet with a larger brush than the calligraphy brush, just a synthetic round. I'm putting the paint on sort of medium wet, not too dry. Now you see me going in with the calligraphy brush again, drawing in the eyebrows. The eyebrows are quite a bit higher than the eyes. I think it is definitely Japanese. And it's important to get those little things more or less correct. Again, I could do with more practice at it. And this is practice really, but I'm just using it as a demonstration video. And her head fades into that highlight, so I've got to be a bit aware of that. Quite a difficult effect to achieve with watercolour. I find it easy to do that kind of thing in oil, but we're not working in oil at the moment. So a few more touches to this landscape before it completely dries. There are suggestions of more trees. It fades off a bit and it's still a little damp. Now it's just a very pale wash of, again, cerulean on this right hand figure's costume. You've got to keep remembering to go over certain bits and not forget them. Okay, now I've sped up the film a little bit and I'm just putting in the bottom, the foot of the vessel, and working on that again with the large brush, same colour scheme. It's quite a lot in shade down there, so I've mixed a darker mix and shading in some of the bottom of the actual main body of the pot as well. So now there's a deep brown, reddy brown decorative line around the bottom. So I'm putting that in whilst the bottom's still wet, in a similar way to the way that I painted around the rim of the lid, and it's still part of the same overall design, and so puts a kind of underscore, if you like, balances that dark at the top. And I'm enhancing some of the shadow a little bit now whilst it's still wet, keeping the edges soft, just working my way, trying to keep the whole image in mind. So you can see I'm mixing up some blues now, but even though it's blue, it's just applying a cool edge and darkening the side of the pot using cool, which works quite nicely against the already warm body of the pot. And I can work that over the now dry areas, and as long as I feather the edge a little bit with some clean water, it'll soften it and you won't really notice it that much. And that just helps to give the pot a bit more form Similarly with the top, there's a little bit of a dark area, and that kind of helps give you a little bit more shape. Taking care to just work over what I've already put down now that's now dry, and that way you can just perhaps exaggerate the form a bit. The photograph itself didn't really show a lot of that. Now the top, the little handle for the lid, is this kind of X, curved X shape, and it's slightly gilded, but I didn't bother too much with that, as are the handles. The important thing about the handles is to try and get them to look fairly convincing, and yet keeping them simple, because they're not much of a focal point really. And so I go in with a similar warm body to start with, and try to keep the each side of the drawn handle parallel to its other side. There'll be light on the top, and then where I'm painting now you can see it's darker under there because the light isn't getting to that so much. And similarly there'll be, that will segue down into lighter upper edge, and then underneath where I'm going now it's shadow again. And that's just observing where the light goes really. There's also a pattern on this particular handle, set of handles, drawn in by the decorator. And again, it's just managing the wet in wet, working on making use of the wetness and softening various areas as I go. The light was slightly different on each of the handles, although I don't really portray that very well. And there's a fair amount of cleaning up to do at the end, just softening some little overspills and areas where you might have just splotted the page a little bit. Some people mask off their page so that they don't splot. I didn't make too many splots on this one, but on some of the others I did. I made a couple of nasty splots. Mostly you can lift them if they're fairly wet, with just a piece of clean tissue or cloth. And if that doesn't work, sometimes applying a bit of water will do so, then blotting them away with a tissue. Again, I'm trying to think of the warms and cools here, so there's a bit of a cooler shadow under this side. In the final thing it doesn't really appear that different. I should have taken a little bit more time. I think that they're not as perfect as they could be, but you could say that about the whole design really. And I think that in conclusion, if you go in with the whole structure and leaving the highlights in the wet in wet, you can build up the whole underpainting quite successfully, and then possibly wait for it to dry or dry it with a hairdryer, and then you can work on the design in a more controlled way. And I think that would work equally well, and possibly you could achieve a more realistic effect if you really wanted to take it to that level and really go to town on edges and highlights and lips of vessels, and really work on it so that it was quite tightly observed. But that's not really what I wanted to achieve in this. Well, that pretty much concludes all I need to do to this particular demo. Just adding my little stamps there. And I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it informative. Please like and subscribe, and if you make comments or ask questions, I'll reply if it's necessary. And here's the finished piece. So I hope you enjoyed it. I'll see you on the next.